else like that. So, you know.
Okay, let's get started. Steve, you're still there?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody. It's Thursday, April 8th, 2021. It's a delight to see you all. Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to be speaking for you tonight. I don't see any guests that need introducing, but Ed did have an update on Vivian, who's in the hospital and coming back tomorrow. And we're happy to hear that. Thank you for that update, and we're delighted to hear that she's recovering well from her flu. Yeah. Okay.
Mike, I had a comment. I'm going to have a Zoom memorial service for Rita on the 24th. It's a Saturday at the 24th at 11 o'clock.
Oh, good. Thank you.
We, unfortunately, the venue still is limited on in-person attendees. So I have a few family members coming, and I think that approaches the limit. So anyway, but you're invited to come or to Zoom in on it. I'll send a notice out. I'll send an announcement out with the mailing list, and so you'll have the information you need to join.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Tom. That sounds great. Did everybody catch that? If not, you'll catch it in email.
There'll be an email going out.
Right. Okay. So without further ado, I will start my talk. Please feel free to jump in and ask questions, and you don't have to raise your hand. Just shout out and interrupt me. And let's see where this thing is. Okay, you all see that?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So this is about my 3 journeys to Russia. Come on, where's my space bar? There we go. Okay, so my name, Mike Peckar, is translates almost directly in Russian to baker. The word baker in Russian is Peckar, and in Polish it's Piekars or Piekars. So it's pretty close to the spelling that we have in English today. Of course, Jewish names are historically patronymic, and when we'll talk more about that when we get to finding my relatives in the old country. But for now, that's about that's where my name comes from.
Okay.
Okay, so when I was in high school, my school offered a student exchange to Russia in the spring of 1980. This was the height of the Cold War, and it was touch and go on whether we were going to go. But the trip was started in New York. And when we said student exchange back then during the Cold War, it was literally an exchange. We stood on one side of a little neutral room in the entryway at JFK, and one by one we went across a hall, and a Russian student would come the other way. So it was literally an exchange of students between Russia and the United States at the height of the Cold War, which was kind of interesting. The trip, what we did is we flew from New York to Helsinki, and then took a boat across the Baltic Sea to Tallinn, which is the capital of Estonia. We toured Tallinn and then flew to Kiev, which of course is the capital of Ukraine. And from Kiev, we flew to Moscow, We stayed in Moscow for a few days, and then we took an overnight train from Moscow to Leningrad. We visited the Hermitage in Leningrad, and then took a train back to Tallinn, and then back across the Baltic Sea on the boat. Okay. Um, the camera pictures, most of them are gone. All the pictures of Tallinn and Kiev are gone because my film was confiscated because I did something bad while I was in Moscow and got the KGB upset at me, and we'll talk about that. So historical context of what was so bad in 1980. If you remember, the United States had boycotted the Summer Olympics in Moscow, and and the reason for that was because Russia had invaded Afghanistan. Um, Kind of ironic to think about today, because since we invaded Afghanistan again in 2003. Um, but this slide kind of lays out the order of it. The blue countries on the map are the countries that boycotted the Olympics. So you can see it was not well attended, um, and that was kind of the context of our visit to Russia. When we got there in the spring, uh, uh, the St. Basil's Cathedral was being spruced up for the Summer Olympics. So there was all these preps for the Summer Olympics. So this is one of my surviving slides showing what we saw at that time of St. Basil's Cathedral. Here's a picture of what it looks like pretty much today. It's a little more spruced up than it was in that picture. Here's the Kremlin Palace. A little history about it over there, and some dates. The Kremlin itself dates from the 11th century and has very interesting history. The walls were built in 1495. It's a beautiful, beautiful set of buildings, and absolutely fantastic to be able to look at. Inside the Kremlin, we have these interesting artifacts of Russian history. Um, Both of these interesting artifacts are huge, but what's really interesting about them is that the cannon was, they fired a cannonball out of it once, and it didn't go very far because it was so huge. And the bell also has a very interesting history. It was built and then rebuilt, and then in the 1730s, when it was built in its current form, the scaffolding around it caught on fire within a week of its completion, and it fell and it cracked, and that was the one time it rang. Interesting stuff. Um, uh, as student exchange students during communist Russia, we took a lot of books and a lot of cigarettes to basically give away to Russian people. A lot of soldiers would come up to us, and for a pack of cigarettes, they'd rip off their belt buckle, which is pictured there on the left, or their hat pin, and hand it to us in exchange for a pack of cigarettes or a book. So I came back with 2 or 3 belt buckles and several hat pins directly from soldiers who were off duty walking around in Red Square. And we gave away a lot of books. One of the interesting conversations we had while we were in Russia was we sat around this large conference table with some fellow students and kind of talked about the merits of capitalism versus communism. And one of the more interesting conversation was the fact that in our system of government we have we have this plethora of choices. In Russia, there's one shower head that you can buy in the store if you need a replacement shower head. and one option for toilet paper. There's not a shelf that's full of different choices. And this was interesting and very enlightening to me as a student to see these contrasts and to see that the efficiencies in the system um, have their benefits, but they also have their setbacks um, between the two systems. But my eyes were opened. Um, on the on one of the nights in Moscow, we had tickets to the Bolshoi Ballet. Um, I was 17 years old and had no interest in sitting at the ballet, and there were a lot of people interested in our tickets. This friend of mine who was from another school, we scalped our tickets and ducked out. And our KGB handlers were not going to give up their seats to the Bolshoi, so we had free reign of the city that night. And what we did is something that we were not supposed to do. We explored the Moscow subway system, and the system is free. You can go wherever you want, and we went up the end of it of almost of 5 or 6 lines, and we found a bar at the end of one of the lines, and um, the Moscow subways were absolutely gorgeous. We got in big trouble when we got back. The KGB came in and turned our rooms upside down and exposed all of our film. And our teachers were extremely upset with us. There's a map of the Moscow subway system. The subways, because Moscow is an inland city. Most cities with subways are near the ocean, so they're not dug that deep underground. The Moscow subway system is hundreds and hundreds of feet underground, very deeply dug down. So you ride these escalators that go forever. And again, every single station is ornate and beautiful. It was to me um, it was a much better at that time. It was a much better experience than sitting in the ballet. But I do regret at this later age missing the Bolshoi ballet. Um, uh, the next day, we toured the State Tretyakov Gallery and saw some art. Um, I liked. I seemed to be uh, drawn to art with very off-color topics. This is a painting of a drowned woman um, by Vasily Perov. This is a painting called "The Shipwreck." This is one of the old icons. Um, this was an interesting story. Princess Terra Canova. The paintings by Flavinsky. It depicts um, a legend that this imposter was killed in a 1770 flood, but in reality, she didn't die in the flood. She was a pretender to the Russian throne. Her name is basically a name that was given her through her notoriety. It's not her real name, and just an interesting story. So the next day we got on the Red Arrow night train from Moscow to Leningrad. It's an 8-hour train ride in this old train. That was a thrill. They serve tea in little from samovars in those little glass cups with little wooden holders, and it's very very elegant and lovely and um, uh, a pleasant experience to have spend a night on a train. Of course, these trains are all gone now. They've been replaced by the high-speed trains, which make the transit in about a third of the time that it took us to ride from Moscow to Leningrad. And there's some statues in Leningrad Center. And there's the Winter Palace across the Neva River. Pictures are a little washed out from being 40 years old and it being a dreary winter day. There's the Hermitage. Absolute magnificent buildings and grounds. Here's some evidence of the World War II siege of Leningrad. Of course, everything's been restored, and some of these buildings were knocked down. But here's a stock photo of the Hermitage Museum, which is a complex of 6 buildings. I think the square footage is incalculable, but it's got 400 rooms. This collection of buildings. And we only got a chance to see a little bit of it, but we walked for days. We walked for 2 days through this thing, and it was just magnificent. There's an aerial photo of just the Winter Palace. Beautiful, beautiful building. And inside is just ornated as it is outside. This is the Raphael Lagius, which is a replica of a Roman fresco. The picture on the right is my picture, and then there's a close-up from a stock photo on the left. And just a gilded room in the Winter Palace, and another gilded room with lots of artwork and filling the walls. This is a Da Vinci Madonna painting. There's a self-portrait of Van Dyck. Every single one of these 400 rooms has a babushka in it, and they'll slap your hand if you get too close to one of the paintings. When I was there, they didn't have these electronic units. They basically had steam heat in a lot of the rooms, and they had towels that were in plates of water. So the babushkas would constantly filling up these very crude humidifiers to keep the paintings from drying out. They're very attentive to to make sure that the right humidity and temperature levels are maintained in these very, very old and very large complex of buildings, which is quite a challenge. Less today than it was 45 years ago. So that's pretty much all the pictures from my student exchange trip to Russia. Again, a lot of the pictures were destroyed by the KGB. So we're going to move on now to my roots trip, which took place in 2006. We had part of our family who lives in England meet up with us from the United States in Warsaw. We spent 2 days with a guide in Warsaw, and from there we flew to Lithuania and toured for a couple of days, and met a couple of guides who drove us in a minivan to Belarus, and to the shtetl where my family came from, and then we came back. So the name of the shtetl was Shuchen, which is shown there in the Russian Cyrillic. It's pronounced differently depending upon different ethnicities and it's pronounced different in Poland than it is in Russia, and even within Belarus, it's pronounced differently by the Jews than it is by the Russians. um, and but we just called it Shushan. That's the closest we could get. Um, we knew very little about my great grandfather Nachum, whose family emigrated from there in 1903. Um, he never spoke of his origins. He moved to London with his family of 4 or 5 kids, and from Schuchen in 1903, and he was a cantor at a synagogue there in London. Um, while on the trip, our guides did some research when we were in the town and found out that he had a 2-year-old daughter who he lost the year before he left the shtetl. We found out his parents' name, and we found out their father's name. Um, and it's hard to do because there are really no last names in the Jewish tradition, and we'll talk more about that. Um, this was a census record from my great grandfather from London in 1911, about 7 or 8 years after he emigrated from Schuchen, showing my my grandfather and all of his siblings, and my great grandfather and his wife, and his occupation and the ages of all of them. My grandfather was 1 year old when they moved from Schuchen to London. Um, so we landed it in Warsaw and met a guide who took us around the next day. Um, this is one of the main thoroughfares in Warsaw. It's closed to traffic most of the time. Um, there's some pictures of the old wall around the city and the old buildings in the town. All of these have been much restored. The town was decimated in World War II, and just some neat pictures. There's a picture of me and my cousin Steve, and a guy playing a flute. Just very peaceful city. There's a picture of the royal castle on the left and what it looked like right after World War II on the right. Big difference. Um, this is a picture of our guide in Poland. His name was Alex. Um, from the outside, the Jewish cemetery looked like a walled-in forest, but once you get inside, it's a forest of gravestones. It's just packed with many old graves. This is a mass grave, this open section. Um, the cemetery is not well cared for. There's not a lot of money available to care for it, and not a lot of Jews left in town. There's some, and they do care for it, but um, it's there's a lot of things going south there in terms of maintenance. Um, this is a memorial marking a sewer hole where some Jews escaped the ghetto um, during the Nazi crackdowns. Um, this is the memorial site at 18 Miller Street, and some pictures of what the ghetto looked like uh, during after it was razed following the uprisings in the Jewish ghetto in 1943. Miller Street is where a lot of those uprisings were organized. And Miller translates to Pleasant Street. One of the few remaining remnants of the old ghetto wall in Warsaw. And this is all of my family and our guide on Peckar Street, which is Baker Street. That's my cousin Pauline and my cousin Clive, and then my uncle Arnold. And there's the guide Alex in the middle. We then went to the Jewish History Museum in Warsaw, and they had this big map on the wall with a whole bunch of buttons under it, with all the names of the shtetls where Jews were, and you could push the button and it would light up a little light where your shtetl was, and you see a little light next to the B in Biało-Rus in the big red letters there under Grodno. That's our shtetl. That's Shuchin. What's interesting about this map was it shows the border of Poland in 1939, which extended well into um, uh, what is now Belarus. Um, what's interesting is about this part of Eastern Europe is how the borders changed over the years. My grandfather would always say that he was from Russian roots, but if he wanted to tell a Polish joke, he said he was from Polish roots. Um, so he was kind of funny about that. But I found that this is another screen from that we found in the Jewish History Museum that showed us information about our shtetl, Shuchin. It talks about the information about the Jewish commune established in the 18th century in 1766 with 401 Jews, in 1847 with 327 Jews, and in 1897 there were 1,356 Jews, which made up 77.8% of the population of the town at the time. Before World War II, there were fewer Jews because they were driven out by the Tsar's pushes and by the communists and all sorts of other things. But there's still over 1,000 Jews in Shuchin um, uh, before World War II started. All of them were killed, um, and we'll see that in a minute. Um, so this is an interesting set of slides I found that show basically the history of who owned what over 1,000 years or so, um, and we'll go through these pretty quick. The star in the middle is the shtetl of Shuchin, and you can see here in the year 950, it was Russian territory. And then 100 years later, in 1050, it was still Russian, but Poland became a force there. Then in 1150, it was still Russian, broken into fiefdoms, more or less, Russian fiefdoms, or there's probably another word for them. And then in 1250, of course, the Mongols invaded and took over um, pretty much the entire area. And then 1350, Lithuania ruled big, and they expanded their territory until in 1450, and in 1550. So Lithuanians held reign over the region for a long time, but then the Russians started to beat them back. The Lithuanians and the Poles kind of merged together to form a commonwealth of their lands in 1650 and 1750. And then in 1850, it was all taken over by Russia, the Austrian Empire to the south, and the Prussian Germans to the west. And then in the year 1900, Russia had expanded further, but Germany was starting to push a little bit too. Um, and then World War I broke out, and there was all kinds of expansion of Germany into Russia during World War I. And then, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 occurred in the middle of World War I. And Germany was still reigning over most of the Belarusian area in that time, and it was still German until the end of World War II. Um, then a year later, the Russians took it back over, and Poland, came back and revived their old territory because the Germans lost the war, of course. And in 1920, the Russians started to expand their territory, and Belarus was pretty much back to where it is today, more or less. Then in 1921, Poland expanded back into Belarus, um, and remained that way right up until World War II. It's 1922, and 1938, and then Germany started to expand, took over Poland, and 1939 and 1940, you can see the Germans expanding back into the Soviet, into Russia, and the line between gray and red there is what we all know as the Eastern Front of World War II, and you can see that 1941 is probably at its greatest extent, and the Russians pushed it back in 1942, and 1943 a little bit more. In 1944, it was they had taken back over the area where my family came from again, and then in 1945, German was gone and Poland was revived as a country, and that was pretty much it between 1945 and 1980. Very little changed other than Romania and Hungary kind of sorting out their border a little bit, and then of course the Latvian countries started to split off from the Soviet Union around 1990, and then Russia collapsed in 1991, and Belarus became its own country. And the difference between 91 and 95 here was Czechoslovakia broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Um, and that's pretty much where we're at today, with Belarus there today. So that was a little diversion. I thought that was fascinating stuff. Um, kind of a little off topic, but I'm just so fascinated by the movement of, uh, of the maps over time. It's just one of my things, I guess. So here's us flying into Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Gorgeous old town. Um, all the streets of the town are crooked on purpose to kind of break up the cold winds that come through. It's my Uncle Arnold looking at the map in front of our hotel. This is a lovely little place, ancient, old buildings. Some of the buildings are remain on stucco just to show their age. Um, these northern cities were not affected very heavily by World War II, so they remain pretty well preserved. This is the Holocaust Museum in Vilnius. What we learned basically is that a lot of the Jews who were killed in Lithuania during the Holocaust were killed by the Lithuanians themselves, not necessarily by the occupying Nazis. Um, this is our family in front of the presidential palace in Vilnius. Um, and this is the St. Paraskiva Church, which has an interesting story. According to our guide, this is the church where Pushkin's great grandfather was baptized by Peter the Great, and we weren't sure that was true, but it turns out that that's exactly what happened at this church. Pushkin was Ganibal's great grandson, um, and Ganibal, of course, was 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 somebody who was kidnapped in Africa and then given to as a gift to Peter the Great um, at the end of the 17th century, and then freed. And he was adopted and raised as Peter the Great's godson and became a general. And he was baptized in 1704 with Peter the Great um, present at this church. And what I said to my family members was, "This is where Pushkin came to shove." We laughed for days about that. This is the trade union headquarters in Vilnius, a big old Soviet edifice that had steps that were made from the gravestones from the Jewish cemetery. The gravestones were taken from the cemetery and cut into steps, so they were vandalized and changed their shape so that they would make good steps. And then, of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were all returned to the Jewish cemetery and made into this monument here. These used to be standalone gravestones that were made into steps by Stalin to his to that trade union building that people walked over for 50 years, and then they were returned to the graveyard as this memorial. Um, this is a mass grave of basically slaughtered Jews during the Holocaust in Vilnius. Um, this is a restored castle just north of Vilnius. It was beautiful to tour around, and uh, this is from the castle looking down on the city, and from there you could see, you know, edifices of the old Soviet era coming down and being raised. Um, from Vilnius, we drove south in a minivan into the Lithuanian side. Um, we saw a lot of folk totems, which is a sign of the country's pagan roots, and we ate really well. They like their meat in Lithuania. I hope there's no vegetarians amongst us. This is a countryside picture driving south through the forest. Um, there's a name for these special wood stacks that are all over the place, but I don't know what it is. I don't remember what it is. Um, um, Along the way, we stopped and um, when we crossed from Lithuania into Belarus, we on purpose picked a remote crossing because it's very difficult to cross into Belarus. Um, there's long waits at the border, and because it's still a communist country, um, very very tough to get through. Um, but our guides knew what to say, when to go. What they went right at shift change, so we got right through. They knew all these tricks. Um, of course, we had visas, but that didn't matter. It's just they don't like people coming in and out of the country. So this is the city of Grodno inside of Belarus on the Niemen River. Of course, this is where Napoleon started his march to Moscow in 1812. We'll talk about that. Um, and a lot of signs of the old Soviet Union in Grodno. Um, and this is an ancient bridge to the old city walls. Uh, near the old city walls. I don't know how old this bridge is, but it's in really bad shape. It's got scaffolding under it that itself is 100 years old. I can't imagine how old this bridge is, but it's older than anything I've ever seen in the States, that's for sure. This is our hotel, the Grodno Tourist Hotel in downtown Grodno. It was really bad. um, I think that they didn't vent their toilets, so the whole hotel smelled like raw sewage. Um, and the food wasn't that good too, but they did give you a little bottle of vodka. This is a department store across the street from the hotel. Of course, those are portraits of Alexander Lukashenko, who remains the leader of Belarus. So he's still there. He's still in power. I was absolutely convinced that right around election time last year, Putin was going to basically annex Belarus. He had all the opportunity in the world to do so, with the United States so distracted by what was going on politically within the United States at the time. And there was a lot of unrest in Belarus following the elections there um, last year. So I thought that Putin was going to just put the hammer down on Lukashenko, but that didn't happen. So I was still waiting for that. Um, there's the old Jewish synagogue in Grodno. It was converted to an art studio during the Soviet times, with the eternal flame replaced with fluorescent lights. There was one old caretaker who opened the door for us. It was a beautiful building with phenomenal acoustics inside. We just sat there in awe, imagining what the cantors must have sounded like in that absolutely um, beautiful hall with fantastic acoustics. Um, we left them a good donation because they were in financial dire straits. From Grodno, we got on the highway east out into the countryside towards our shtetl. The countryside was very much like interior United States, like the farm belt, very flat, very agrarian, except for one thing. There's a lot of just industrial factories splattered out all over the place. These kind of Russian communist era factories um, where all the goods are made. Um, this is the sign, which is the entrance to Schuchen. It says Schuchen on it. It's unusual for a little town to have a sign like this, but the reason it did is because this town hosted a very large Air Force base during the Soviet period, um, and we got to the center of town, and because um, uh, Belarus is still a communist country, Lenin still stands in every town square. So there's me posing next to Lenin on the right there. This was the bakery in Schuchen, and we tried to get in, but they wouldn't let us in. Uh, and those orange vats, or those yellow vats, are full of kvass, which is the fermented drink of choice for the people of this region. Um, Kvass is basically stale bread that's fermented, um, and it's got a variety of different um, fruits added to it depending upon the region. We tried some. it was drinkable, but it was not great. But this was this was the oops. Um, we went and bought some bread at the local grocery store, and wanted to eat the bread that was made in the bakery that was very likely our family's bakery 100 years ago, or 115 or 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Um, and the kids were baffled why these exotic tourists were in their town going to buy peasant food. So yeah. This is a common sight in the shtetl. Kind of this shows kind of the gestalt of the town now. It's got the brutalist Soviet architecture. You've got the old uh, Russian cars that break down and that all spew a lot of diesel smoke. And you also have horse-drawn carriages. Very agrarian town, surrounded by farmland. Almost everybody in town is a farmer. This is an old shul. That's now somebody's house. Um, we had trouble finding the Jewish cemetery and the Holocaust memorial in town, so we asked for directions. And this 80-year-old lady basically got on her bike and led us there by a bike. She said, "Follow me, I'll take you there."
Mhm.
And this little caged off area is the Holocaust memorial. It's right next to the old, to one of the control towers for the air base. The air base is gone, and all of the runways were converted back into farmers' fields. But a lot of the old air base structures are still there, um, and you can see in this picture that a farmer's field that actually used to be a runway, and it's very close to right next to the Holocaust memorial, where over 1,000 Jews were shot and buried right there. Um, Basically, the whole town. We went around looking for any Jews, and there were two. One of them was a post-war Jew who had moved there, but we found this lovely lady whose name was Anastasia. She did not get slaughtered with the Jews in town because she joined the army, and she was transferred to out of town, and was safe behind enemy lines. She was safe, um, you know, as a Russian soldier, while her whole family and town were shot and buried in the ground. The Russians who served in the war are very patriotic. You see her wearing her medals in this picture. She insisted on putting them on because, um, again, they're very patriotic folks. Um, the, um, the cemetery was not cared for, and we left her with enough money to put a fence around it because cows had been grazing in it, and um, uh, uh, we she was delighted to see some relatives of people, and she shared a lot of information. She had some old books, um, and here's a picture of inside of her apartment. Very small. It was one of the typical brutalist Russian housing units, and it's a picture she showed us of Jews in the town um, before World War II. Um, we don't know if any of these might have been my family members. There were at least two family members listed in the town's necrology list with our last name, and we have no idea how they're related to us, but we know they are related to us. Um, and here's kind of the family tree that we reconstructed. We found two gravestones of family members. We found the gravestone of my great um, my great grandmother Paulina and my great great grandmother Relka. And we were delighted to find those. We spent a lot of time searching for any of the others, but we couldn't find them. And something that the guide dug up while we were there was a copy of an obituary record for my great grandfather's 2-year-old who died in Schuchen right before he moved to London. And this is us looking around in the Jewish graveyard. Again, it's overgrown and uncared for and surrounded by farmers' fields where every once in a while a cow wanders through. Um, and again, we left enough money for them to put a fence around it and and mow it once a year. So we're looking for the gravestones. Of course, they're all in Hebrew, and only a couple of us could read Hebrew, so it was a long process. And you could see how thickly overgrown this graveyard has become. It's now much better. And this is my great grandmother, um, Paulina, her gravestone, and that was Nachum's uh, um, wife. Yeah. Oh, that's no, that's her. That's his wife's mother. So it's a great great grandmother. Okay, sorry. And this is the great great grandmother on my father's side, um, Relka, and we were delighted to find that. And the grave translates to "Here's buried modest woman and righteous our teacher Relka, daughter of Reb Shmuel Zui. He died at the beginning of Elul, 1897." So Zui means our dear. So it's our dear Samuel, basically. Uh, and again, there's no last names on the gravestones because even though the Russians enforced last names onto the Jewish people um, earlier in the 19th century, um, the Jews by practice didn't put those names on the grave. It was patronymic naming, so it would be Relka, daughter of Sam, and that's all it says is Relka, daughter of Sam. There's no last name there. So it's very hard to trace back and to find any ancestors beyond this because of that naming scheme. Um, and then we piled back in the car and went home after that wonderful victory of finding our forebears. And that brings me to my third trip to Russia. As a New Year's resolution in in 2012, the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, I made a New Year's resolution to read War and Peace. And I'm a slow reader. It took me 9 months to read the book because, like I said, I'm a slow reader. But what was fascinating is that as I was reading it, starting it in January, at some point around June, of course, War and Peace is a chronology, right? So there's a time scale in the reading of War and Peace, and at some point I caught up to it and then went past it. Um, but this is Menard's graph of the invasion of Moscow by Napoleon. Um, I learned about this from Edward Tufte, who wrote a lot of books about um, using graphical information and stuff like that. Some of you might be familiar with it. Um, But what's fascinating about this graph is that it shows four variables in a single graph. It shows time, space, number of men, and the temperature. The big bar on the left in beige shows that 422,000 troops crossed the Niemen River um, uh, at a date which is on the map somewhere. And then as they marched east towards Moscow, their troops dwindled. Some of them split off and then regrouped with the thing. And then when they got to Moscow, um, there was only 100,000 troops left. And then when they retreated from Moscow, that's when the cold set in, and the bottom shows the temperature in some form of degrees that I don't know, not Celsius or Fahrenheit. Um, some French um, uh, scale of degrees, and only 10,000 troops made it back across the Niemen after that very, very cold winter. Um, but that was my third trip to Russia, is reading that book and reliving the War of 1812. And that's about it. Um, there's a picture of the Soviet Union before it broke up. Are there any questions or comments?
Did you mention a British branch of the family too?
Right. So my great grandfather Nahum left Shuchen and went to London,
Right.
where he raised his family, and there were four or five siblings of my grandfather. My grandfather emigrated to the United States in 1920. The rest of them stayed in England. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Um,
you mentioned like a British branch met you on your roots trip.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. So my cousin Pauline and my cousin Clive, who were on the Roots trip, Pauline lives north of London, and Clive lives in Manchester.
Mhm.
When you went to Moscow as a student, you said you had a debate or communism versus capitalism or something. Now, who were you debating with? The Secret Service or other students? Did you have
Well, yeah,
Russians?
they brought in students from a school in Moscow
Oh,
that
okay.
were in the same grade we were.
Okay.
It was basically just an exchange of ideas about the different political systems of our countries.
What was your impression of those students?
Oh, they all spoke English.
Huh,
It was amazing because they were all taught English, and they all spoke it pretty well, and they were able to articulate pretty well. Some of them better than others, but I was really impressed that their education system was very strong and very merit based back then. Um, I was and they made some very compelling arguments um, for what was wrong with our systems.
okay.
One thing I was impressed by was the cleanliness of those towns that you were in. No litter, no, I mean, it was just Disney World, pristine.
Yeah, we did see some graffiti in Vilnius, and we did see some evidence of drug use and hoodlums in Vilnius. But other than that, and there was a little bit of that in Warsaw too, a little bit of a seedy side of Warsaw. But we were also in the top tourist areas, and that's where we took our pictures. Um, and there were some very poor areas of Belarus. And I should have shown some of those, some of the pictures I took of some of the decaying, brutalist Soviet housing units that, with windows falling out that people are still living in. It's a pretty poor part of the world still. I mean, you saw people driving horse carts. Um,
We're out in Berkeley, California at the moment, and I've been driving by a lot of tent cities for homeless people. So we have nothing to brag about.
right.
Did you feel a sense of connection when you were in some of the smaller towns?
Well, I felt kind of the opposite of that, Janet. I felt that I felt this heavy weight on me that these towns were in some cases over 90% Jewish and had one Jew left in them, and that all their memories are gone and wiped away, and just the slate was completely and very successfully wiped clean. Um, in in Vilnius, we saw some kids who we saw this kind of culture of kind of there's a lot of nationalistic pride, and it's very much surrounded around there's very obvious um, um, racism and kind of almost an Aryan kind of of, uh, of nationalism among we saw amongst the kids in Vilnius. They really don't care about the the Jewish history there, or really acknowledge their part in it at all. And um, it was disturbing. It's disturbing to see.
Are they in Lithuania? Are they having the same reaction as the Poles are about investigating collaboration with the Nazis? I mean, recently they've been talking about how it's illegal in Poland to say anything, to say that Poles collaborated with Nazis in the Holocaust.
I haven't followed that, and my impression is that that they're doing very little in terms of governmental efforts to reconcile or any of those things. I didn't see any of that while I was there. It was 2006. I don't know what's been going on there since. I know that Lithuania and Estonia in particular have become very competitive with Russia, and that since they became independent countries, they have there's been a lot of nationalism around um, building their esteem as an independent country. And one of the pieces of evidence that leads me to say that is they're very heavily invested in high tech, and they also house some of the the world's greatest hackers in these countries. But um, I'm in the IT industry, so I know that I know this from firsthand, having dealt with with coders from these countries directly, and that they're very prideful about showing the Soviets that they can do very well without their rule over them. Um, this is very much opposed to the pro-communist leanings of Belarus, which kind of had the nostalgia for the communist times, which still remains amongst the people very strong.
Well, I don't think either the Poles or the Lithuanians or the Latvians, Estonians ever particularly cared for the Russians being there. But my understanding is that there's a fairly significant Russian minority in the Baltic states left over from the Soviet era. And that's probably one of those nationalistic issues that they got to be careful about how they treat those people.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense.
Isn't Belarus doing pretty well with COVID? That they've kept their numbers down? Am I correct in my impression?
I do know that they have this pretty strong healthcare, socialized medicine there. One of the interesting things that I learned on my trip to Russia is how the doctors there are not paid highly like they are. They're paid well, but they're not. They don't live in mansions and drive BMWs like they do in the United States. But they're very highly respected, and it's a very highly respected profession, and um, everybody respects and basically takes care of themselves with respect to their health. It's much more of a proactive healthcare system, and I think they actually have they have problems with drug abuse and alcohol abuse, of course, but I think that in general they're healthier people than they are even in the United States. They've got such good health care.
Did you ever learn to speak Russian?
I learned a few words on just in preparation for my trip. Just enough to get by, but I never really studied it in earnest. No.
With the breakup of the Soviet Union, Lech Walesa in Poland was important. I'm curious, was Lech Walesa in Poland supportive of the Jewish communities or not?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that question.
I think that country is basically Catholic.
Right. I would think he would be a very faithful Catholic, and I think he was close to the Pope and that type of thing. So, for what it's worth.
Wasn't there something about him being a secret collaborator with the government, like Walesa?
I hadn't heard that.
At some point, there's something that was damaged his reputation at some point. I seem to recall, but
Which government? The United States?
no,
Soviet?
the communist government or
Oh,
whatever. He was, doing something. I'll have to check again. I thought I remember. It was something that was.
He was a labor leader, wasn't he? And he came up through the labor movement.
Yes, yeah, in Gdansk.
Yeah. So,
Well, the Polish government was under General Jaruzelski, and Lech Walesa was put under house arrest for a while. He was fighting the government,
right.
fighting the Polish government.
Hmm.
Joseph, you've been to Russia, correct?
Yeah, I thank you, Mike. This was a very interesting presentation on your part. I traveled to the Soviet Union in 1987 when Mikhail Gorbachev was in power. I went with a group of Americans and Canadians and about 50 Russian journalists, and on the Volga peace cruise. We were amongst that large group of people, I read once that some 200,000 people crossed the Iron Curtain to travel throughout the Soviet Union in those years, just to meet their Soviet counterparts and break this barrier of ignorance and fear. And we traveled from Leningrad to Rostov-na-Donu in the south, and then crossed on the Stalin Canal to the Volga River, and then on a cruise ship up the Volga River, stopping at Stalingrad and Ulanovsk, where Lenin was born. And I was thinking as people talked about the language, it was said in this trip that there were more teachers of English in the Soviet Union than there were students of Russian in the United States. Everybody spoke English on this trip. Also, the KGB was present. It was true. And at one point, I was treated to dinner with a leader of the Sane Freeze, if you remember that peace movement. We were treated to dinner in the apartment of a KGB major general, retired. And it was really true that the peace movement was very much state supported, and the KGB provided senior officers for this, but we were not hiding anything. It was all open and above board. We wanted to meet our Soviet counterparts. It was the most profound experience, well, not the most, but one of the most profound experiences of my life. I treasure that trip. I have a caricature on my wall here, drawn by artists of the Russian humor magazine Crocodile, and it's a real treasure. I brought gifts for the Soviets, for children, for one thing. I brought Boy's Life, and we met children in the Young Communist League, wearing red kerchiefs around their necks, and I also brought along the New Yorker because it had cartoons in it, and I thought, so those kinds of things I gave away. Also postcards of the Statue of Liberty and little statuettes, which I bought in souvenir shops in New York before we went. I'll tell you the experience that I remember so vividly, and this has to do with children, was the sight in small towns in central Russia, particularly, of all the dead. And there would be outside of a village, there would be some kind of memorial stone, and the names, one after the other, of all the dead in the Great Patriotic War. I was, and also there would be a little flag somewhere, and children in Komsomol, the youth organization, would be standing guard at the flagpole, sometimes with an unloaded Uzi submachine gun. They're kind of at attention. The children, well, I don't know if they appreciated what happened to the Jews so much, but they certainly appreciated what happened to their country when it was overrun by Nazi Germany. And young people were proud to stand at attention in a semi-military pose at the flagpole commemorating the Great Patriotic War and the rule of the Soviet Union in protecting them, actually from the West, you know. And I have other experiences. I wish I could tell you this. It takes a little too long, but we traveled on this ship up the Volga River, as I said. And one Sunday, the Americans and the Canadians thought, well, let's have a Sunday service. So we all poured into the forecastle, the the area near the bow of the ship, and one of us was a Quaker minister from the Midwest, and some Quaker Friends meetings have paid ministers. It's very unusual, not like Cambridge, but in the Midwest they had paid ministers, and one of them was with us. So we were all keen to have a Quaker meeting up front, and he presided. But you know what happens in a Quaker meeting? Everybody descends into the silence, and waits for the Spirit to move them. So the Soviets with us decided they'd like to see this. This is what the Westerners do. They have religion. What is this all about? So they came in too. So about 150 people crammed into the forecastle that Sunday morning, and we just began to have a silence. Well, they looked around and says, "Is this religion?" And we, but what happens in a Quaker meeting is that people do get moved by the Spirit. And here we were trying to make peace with the Soviet Union, and we were deep in their country, and we had a lot to say. So people would get up and testify. And then there'd be a silence as everyone listened. And, usually a minute or two to internalize what had been said. And then somebody else would get up, and the same thing went on. It was profound. I mean, talk about religion. This was real religion. This was people meeting people, and on a mission of peace and ending the Cold War. Well, I mean, that was it. The Soviets were just amazed. This is what they've been fighting all these years. That was a very nice bit of contact on that Volga peace cruise.
It's a great story. It was very, very, very interesting.
My wife, Vivian, and myself and our youngest son, Jeffrey, had been scheduled to go to the Summer Olympics in Russia when President Carter asked us to boycott. That's precisely what we did. We boycotted. But we went to Russia for a year or two later. And in the 2 weeks that we were there, we had a young Russian lady with us for the entire trip. And as the trip began to end, she came to two Texans and myself, and she asked, could we figure out a way to get her out of Russia and come into the United States? Well, it turns out we were kind of serious about trying to help her do that, but there was no practical way to do it, and we felt pretty badly about it. Another element of our trip was that on the way back, we flew from, I guess, Moscow to Stockholm, Sweden, and actually flew from Sweden to the United States. And it was very interesting to watch. When we got off that airplane in Stockholm, every one of us got onto our knees and kissed the runway in a free country. And those are some of the things that I remember. One other small part of the story, but not small for our son Jeffrey, a number of young Russians wanted our son Jeffrey to marry one of the girls. Well, that might have been interesting to Jeffrey, but not enough to really do it. So he had that separately in part of Russia. He disappeared. We didn't see him for, well, we saw him each night, but he spent time with Russian young people and they wanted to spend time with him. So we didn't worry too much because he returned each evening. And so he had his own experience with young Russians, some of whom wanted to come to the United States, and others who wanted him to marry one of them and stay in Russia. He made his own decisions and came back to the United States with us.
Michael, can I ask you? I really liked your pictures, your virtual tour of Vilnius, Lithuania. That I saw another such virtual tour recently, and that one was disappointing. It did not show the crooked streets or explain the north winds, but it just said all of the nice big buildings were destroyed in World War II, mainly by the Nazis. And they said there's one beautiful building in Vilnius today, and that's what they showed us. And they said it was the KGB building because the only building the Russians would allow money to be spent on to make it ornate, aesthetically beautiful, was the KGB building. And I don't think most people here were interested in that.
I'm wondering if the edifice that we saw coming down might have been that building. Okay, nothing else? No other comments or Frank? Okay,
Thank you very much.
Virginia,
Yeah.
good to see you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you all for your time and indulgence. I enjoyed it. Hope you did too. And we don't have a speaker yet for our final talk of the year. I'll try to scooch something up. Good luck to me.
I look forward to seeing the recording, Mike.
Okay.
I think
Thank
Ed Clark once made a proposal. Maybe Ed would do his talk.
Well, Ed said he wants to do his talk live. He doesn't want to do it on Zoom.
Oh,
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
And,
It's really great to see everyone.
in the fall,
Yeah.
we'll be back together again, I think.
Take
Yep.
care.
Okay.
got my shot.
Bye-bye. See you next
Bye.
month.
Yep.
Thank you.